Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis. I'm your host, and I'm glad you're here. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Charles Cornish-Dale, a man a lot of you may know as Raw Egg Nationalist. He's an Oxford and Cambridge-trained historian. He was the star of Tucker Carlson's documentary The End of Men alongside RFK Jr., and he's recently released a new book with a provocative title called The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity. We get into all of it, his strange path from medieval church historian to one of the most influential voices in the MAHA movement featured on Tucker Carlson. In fact, the way I kind of found out about The Last Men as a book was actually listening to Ezra Klein's podcast, of all places, with the New York Times. They were giving it a review over there on their podcast, and they really failed to grasp the topics in it. And I was like, I've got to reach out to this guy because I want to hear more. Turns out we have a lot we write about that overlaps. So if you've read Offensive Christianity, The Last Men really overlaps with that. We're going to talk about the MAHA movement, why he thinks liberalism itself is a low-testosterone system. We're going to talk about endocrine disruptors, Fukuyama, Nietzsche, Christian vitalism, and whether Christianity has the vitality left to fight. So you're really going to enjoy this episode. Before we get into that, I want to make sure you know about a few things coming up. First of all, if you haven't signed up for Commonplace, you're missing out. Commonplace is a website that I launched to do serious theological work, whether it's sermon prep writing or research, or even if you're just a layman interested in better sources and better material, better commentaries than you're going to get on the mass market and in Christian Bible software and other places. Commonplace is a AI-powered research assistant built on more than 400, I think we're up to 600 Reformed and Puritan primary sources. So we're talking Calvin, Owen, kind of what you expect, but also Turretin, Spurgeon, the Westminster Standards, and even Latin scholastics that have been translated into English for the first time ever. It's all grounded in actual sources with real citations. There's not a lot of, in fact, there's zero AI hallucinations. There's no nonsense. It's like having the best theological library in the world, plus a research assistant who's ready to help you out. So go to commonplace.study. You can sign up for a free 14-day trial today. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Start digging around. I think it's a great resource. I'm using it this week to preach through Proverbs on parenting. And so I'm going to get into Commonplace and use it for sermon research, but I use it all the time to ask any kind of theological questions just to point me back to good sources. Second, for the men, I want to invite you personally to Burn the Ships. Burn the Ships is the annual men's conference of the Weld Church in Boulder. And it's held July 31st to August 2nd. It's going to be a great time. We're going to have Dr. Stephen Wolf and Dr. Joe Rigney out. I'll be speaking, so will Pastor Matt Patrick. It's a great time to get together. We're having a men's workout on Saturday morning. You're going to have to register and then RSVP for that because we have limited spots available. With your ticket, you get food, a concert, and get to network with other guys. You're really not going to want to miss it. Head to boulderwell.org/burntheship. Sign up today, register today, and come learn and really enjoy a time that's more less public, you might say, because we actually don't publish a lot of these talks. We want it to be a more conversational environment where people can speak their mind freely and not have fear of any kind of press or anything like that. We're not doing it for publicity. We're doing it to equip you to be a strong, courageous man today. So sign up for Burn the Ships today. And then finally, this conversation we're going to have with Raw Egg Nationalist today overlaps with a lot of the book that I wrote, Offensive Christianity, like I mentioned already. You need to go pick up the book. If you have not picked up the book, I don't know what you're doing. You need to go pick it up today. OffensiveChristianityBook.com is where you can find copies. Leave a review wherever you, now listen. You can listen to the book. I read it to you. I've for those who are, into Audible and listening to books, I myself have read you the book. You can go find that on Audible. You can also pick it up at offensivechristianitybook.com. So go buy a copy, leave a review, let me know what you think. And I'm hearing all sorts of great reviews coming in, everyone from police officers to pastors, just men in their industries and vocations, giving it out to other guys, feeling inspired. I recently got a great review from an older retired SBC pastor who wrote that it really inspired him, and this is the book we need for men today. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. But with that said, let's get into our conversation with Dr. Charles Cornish-Dale. But Charles, thanks for coming on the show today.
It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to it.
So, Charles, I've been kind of keeping up with some of your work after seeing you on Tucker. Obviously, the book you've written, we're kind of touching on a lot of the same topics. And so I wanted to start a conversation and have a conversation with you about the book. Before we get into that, I discovered something about you that I don't know how public it is, but you are a doctor, you have a PhD, and you actually did your dissertation, I think at Oxford, in
I
kind of
did.
early medieval theology. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, so yeah, so I read for a DPhil in history at Oxford from 2015 to 2018. I was at Lincoln College. I was supervised by Professor Dermot McCulloch, Sir Dermot McCulloch, who was the big. I think he's retired now, but he was the professor of the history of Christianity, real big figure in church history. One of the like the big guys at Oxford in the history department. And my PhD, my DPhil, was about the Reformation. It was the Reformation in a longue durée, which is the phrase that's associated with the Annales school. Where you look at things over a long period of time, basically. So what I was doing was I was looking at the Reformation on a local level in one parish that had in Dorset, which is my native county in Dorset, in England rather, and was looking at this one parish has amazing medieval records, and so I could look at religious life before the Reformation, through the Reformation, and kind of after. And I was asking questions like, how much actually really changed, because I mean, we tend to think of the Reformation as this, monumental event, a cataclysm maybe, or a wonderful liberation, but it was a big thing, and it saw momentous changes to religious life. It fractured Christendom. It set England on its unique path to kind of world historical greatness, etc. But what was it actually like on the level of a parish? How much did religious life change in this one community, Wimborne Minster in East Dorset? And it was incredibly interesting. I was very inspired by the work of Eamon Duffy. I don't know if you're familiar. Are you familiar with Eamon Duffy? So
I'm
Eamon
not, no.
Duffy, he wrote, I think it was 1994, he wrote a book called The Stripping of the Altars that was about the Reformation in England. And it was kind of the beginning of a sort of revisionist approach to the Reformation in England. He argued that actually late medieval Christianity wasn't moribund. It wasn't kind of ripe for Reformation. It had a lot of life to it. People were ordinary parishioners were very involved in religion. There was a common religious culture among all levels of society. It wasn't like there wasn't kind of a split between elite literate religious culture and kind of lower lay devotional culture. So he very much presented the Reformation as a kind of cataclysm in England. But then he wrote another book that was much more of an inspiration for me, called The Voices of Morbarth, which was a study of one parish, a very small parish on the edge of Exmoor, which is quite a kind of wild area of the West Country, a small rural parish, which has very, very interesting medieval records, churchwardens' accounts, which are records of spending on the kind of day-to-day religious life of the parish, maintenance of the church, unglamorous stuff, but also recording, various payments and changes that are associated with the Reformation. But it was the kind of the kind of model that he used of a kind of rich, almost novelistic account of one community's journey through the Reformation, led by its priest, by the parish priest, that really kind of inspired me to do something similar with Wimborne Minster, and to try to write an account of the Reformation that really sort of focused on the human interest of the Reformation. So ordinary people's experience of these momentous changes, I mean, there was a lot of number crunching in there because I was using financial records like church wardens' accounts and all that kind of stuff. So there were graphs about, expenditure on maintenance of the church and payments for seating in the church, trends over a long gifts to the church and bequests in people's wills and all that kind of stuff. Like long-term trends that you could actually use to chart long-term trends. You could look at, well, were people giving more money to the church after the Reformation or before, and all that kind of stuff. But then there was also a kind of a lot of evidence, wills in particular, other stuff that allowed me really to get very close to ordinary people and what they were doing and their relationships within the community and all this kind of stuff. So it was an interesting, quite unusual project. I mean, I used medieval records that basically no one had ever touched. So antiquarians had touched them and catalogued them a little bit, written about them in obscure local journals and stuff like that. But nobody had used these medieval records as the basis for a full-length study. So it was exciting, and it was a real privilege actually, to be able to use these amazing records that started the church wardens' accounts, some of the earliest in England, started in 1403. Amazing, exciting. And that's actually one thing that I do miss, is I do miss going into an archive and, being the first person to properly handle a medieval will or a church wardens account or something. That's the really exciting part actually of doing academic history for me, or it was.
Yeah, no, it can be very exciting. I mean, in America, we don't have that long of a history when it comes to churches, but even in my context of Boulder, you can go into these older churches and you see their registries, and it can be very exciting because nobody pays attention to those.
Sure.
And it's like if these, especially the liberal churches, would remember their history and remember who they were, there's such an account and a testimony of faithful witnesses who have gone before us. It almost feels like when you're in the archives doing that kind of work, you're like Indiana Jones discovering something for the first time. So I totally get the appeal. With your particular work, was it more of like, I want to get the DPhil from Oxford and I've got to figure out a topic to address, or was this coming from somewhere else? You wanted to be an academic, you wanted to be a church historian. What drove you to do that?
I think I've always loved history. I was always very good at history and very interested in history when I was at school, and I naturally went on to study history then at university. I had a few years out from university. I left Cambridge and had a few years off, but I was there was part of me that just didn't want to have a normal job, like I didn't particularly want to go into the world of work. I did want to write and research and indulge in my intellectual interests. I had the project before I went to Oxford, because that's what when you apply for a doctorate, then that's what you have to do. You have to have some kind of project and you put it forward as part of your application, and you're allocated funding or not on the basis. I got a full academic scholarship on the basis of the project, so I didn't have to pay for anything, which was nice. I suppose I probably did do the PhD thinking, yeah, I'm going to continue and I'm going to become an academic, or try to become an academic. I wasn't really under any illusions about the direction in which academia is tending. And certainly, as a postgraduate initially, I changed from history to social anthropology when I was at Cambridge. I studied social anthropology. I did an MPhil in social anthropology, and then I actually started a PhD at Cambridge in social anthropology. I was writing about going to research Buddhism, go to the Far East, live in a Buddhist monastery, which I did very briefly, and then I hated it. But social anthropology, unlike history, is a very radical leftist. Probably one of the most rabidly left disciplines actually in the academy. And I transferred from history to anthropology thinking, oh, it's going to be like Evans Pritchard. It's going to be like, these sort of gentlemen explorers going to Africa in the 1930s, writing about strange customs and witchcraft and asking questions about rationality and stuff like that. But actually, anthropology now as a discipline is about, like studying transgender activist groups in Italy and refugee theatre companies in Germany and stuff. And I mean, it's incredible. It's a discipline that's basically at war with itself, and certainly at war with its own history. I mean, the standard viewpoint that is taught, and certainly that's taught at Cambridge, is that anthropology before 1960 or 1970 was an irredeemably racist discipline. It was a handmaiden of colonialism, and if you learn anything about the discipline before 1970, it's that, like, you don't need to read Evans Pritchard. You don't really need to read Levi-Strauss. You don't need to read Malinowski. All that stuff is bunk. And it was only when we had this sort of colonial critique, as they call it, and the arrival of postmodern theory and all this other kind of stuff that actually, anthropology started to sort of move in the right direction. So I mean, I had a taste of the humanities at their most radically left wing, and I didn't really like it very much. I mean, I thought that going to Oxford and just studying medieval history, I would be immune from that. But it was actually quite surprising how similar the disciplines were. And in fact, what was kind of worse about it in a way at Oxford was that history was kind of further behind the curve than anthropology. So stuff that was supposedly exciting in anthropology 10 or 15 years before was just kind of coming into history, the kind of same kind of left-wing theory, but it was all newfangled and everyone was really excited about it. And I mean, I think universities in general aren't particularly good places to be a European man,
Right.
So I was probably at a disadvantage in certain respects anyway. And then, I mean, my project, which was a very, very kind of scholarly project, it was rooted in an archive, a source base. I mean, I was a very good Latinist. I've let my skills slip a bit, but you have to be a paleographer. You have to be able to read old script. I mean, it was a scholarly project. It was an old school project rooted in sources, empirical evidence first, maybe a bit of theory on top, but certainly not being led by theory. Whereas actually the kind of stuff that actually really now gets you ahead in your career is stuff that intersects much more with present day concerns about identity and race and gender and all this kind of stuff. And so I was kind of at a double disadvantage, not only who I am, but also the fact that actually I'm doing like old school scholarship rather than something that's trendy, that uses French theory, that's about gender or disabilities or all of those things. And so as my project progressed, as I was researching and writing the DPhil, then I did get a very, very clear sense that I would not be able to get a job. And I mean, I did apply for some jobs, but as my DPhil came to an end, but I mean, it was, I didn't get a postdoctoral position or anything like that. So that was, that required me then to pivot. And I mean, I went back into kind of job in the literary industry that I had before. And then I started posting on Twitter and some very strange things started to happen.
Right. Yeah. My next question was going to be, how does a sensitive young man who was interested in being an academic turn into, a character on Twitter known as Raw Egg Nationalist? And I'll make sure to put a link for those who don't follow, if you want to follow Charles on Twitter. But what was that turn like? Was it kind of a radical change for you? Did the academy kind of radicalize you and kind of, so to speak, and kind of inculcate this desire to create a persona online, or did you get into health all of a sudden randomly in your DPhil? What was it that kind of spurred your interest in that?
Well, yes, I mean, health has been a big focus for me. I mean, as the Raw Egg Nationalist, I mean, I was always a sportsman at school. I played rugby, football, athletics, was a martial arts instructor in my late teens, taught kickboxing and competed a little bit. So I've always cared about my physical fitness and my health. I've always enjoyed sports. So that in itself wasn't so much of a departure. I mean, being at Oxford, I think around 2016. So I started my PhD and my DPhil in 2015 and ended it in 2018. Handed it in. That was a very interesting time to be at university, and yeah, in many respects, it did make me much more explicitly political than I had been. I mean, I grew up in the countryside. I grew up in Dorset, very rural part of England, very conservative part of England. I would describe my parents as conservative by inclination. I grew up around, in beautiful countryside, loads of history everywhere, medieval churches, even older history, even older stuff than medieval. So I mean, I always had a great appreciation and reverence for the past, for England's past. So I mean, it was all there, I think, in embryo. But I would say that yes, being at Oxford around the time of the European Union referendum, Brexit, and then Donald Trump, really did start to make me think much more explicitly about who I was, in opposition to all of these crazy people that I'd been thrown in with, who I just felt this instinctual revulsion towards. I mean, it was really like people's behavior when Donald Trump was elected, for example, in Oxford. It was crazy. It was mad, absolutely mad. I can remember it was the beginning of my second year. And I was living in a house with this guy he was a weird guy. It was a nice house, but I was sharing it with this weird guy. And he was like a card-carrying Trotskyist. He would go after in the evening to these like socialist workers' party meetings and stuff. Yeah. And I can remember going to bed on the night of the election and just thinking, oh yeah, I'm sure Hillary Clinton's probably going to win. And then I came down in the morning and was having a coffee and turned on my laptop and whatever, and oh my God, Donald Trump has won. I'm sat there like laughing my ass off about it, watching clips and stuff, and the Young Turks, watching them freak out and all that kind of stuff. And this chap I'm living with comes downstairs. I can hear him sloping down the stairs. And he comes in the kitchen, and honestly, he looked like he had seen his entire family murdered in front of him or something. Like no colour in his face at all. Genuinely like a ghostly pallor. And he says to me, "Oh, Charlie, I can't believe this. This is so terrible. What's happening? This is, And I say, oh yeah, Michael, it's dreadful, isn't it? He, slopes off, goes on his bike or whatever, and I'm just sat there for the whole day laughing, watching Donald Trump clips. But I mean, we were getting welfare emails, I remember. So the college chaplain. So each college has a priest basically who, does services in the church, but also is responsible for student welfare. And we got a welfare email from the chaplain. My door is open. This is, all day. This is absolutely terrible. Just come in and vent if you need to vent. This is the dawn of fascism in America, blah, blah, blah. It's so terrible. And just walking around the city, then it was like this oppressive atmosphere had just kind of descended. I mean, you could feel it. You could really feel it. And there were people protesting and just all sorts of, and I'm like, this is the guy who presented The Apprentice. This is the guy who shaved Vince McMahon's head on SmackDown. I mean, like, and you're telling me that this guy's Hitler. So I was, I mean, I got a real dose actually of radical left-wing politics, and also a real sense that it was very much on the march, and that really, that did make me think much more explicitly. But I mean, in 2018, I read a book called Bronze Age Mindset. It was just after it had been released. It was recommended to me actually on Amazon, which is quite funny. The algorithm actually did some did some interesting work there, because I've been reading Nietzsche for some time. I went through a big Nietzsche phase when I was in my early 20s, as I think maybe a lot of young men do, reading a lot of Nietzsche. And this book was recommended to me, and I bought it thinking it looked strange and interesting, and read it and found it quite revelatory in a number of different ways. And that's what led me to Twitter, really. First as just a kind of lurker account, lurking and laughing at Bronze Age perverts tweets and other tweets of, from people in the same kind of galaxy as him. And then, I actually have trouble kind of reconstructing what happened. It's a bit weird. I've suddenly ended up as a like minor e-celebrity with 320,000 followers on Twitter, and I've been on Tucker Carlson and all this kind of other stuff. But it definitely wasn't planned. That's one thing I can say. It wasn't. I didn't have a plan to do it. It just kind of happened that I ended up posting about politics and fitness and the intersection between health and fitness and politics and biology and politics. And for a long time, I avoided talking about things like the Reformation and my research, because I didn't want to give the game away who I was.
Sure.
So I haven't really talked that much until recently, until my identity was actually revealed by left-wing activists in the UK. Didn't really give much away about my kind of scholarly background, but now I'm free to do that, and so I do. I posted something, I don't know if you saw it on Substack. I actually posted an academic article that I wrote and had published. It was actually published after I was doxxed, funnily enough, but
wow.
it was an academic piece about a book of manuscript sermons that I discovered in America. So when I was doing my PhD, I wrote about a preacher in Dorset called Francis Frampton. And he was just a minor character. But anyway, I managed to find in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., a book of his manuscript sermons. So
that's amazing.
It was his notebook where he was, so it wasn't polished or anything. He was writing out sermons, and you could see him correcting stuff, and there was sort of interesting in the back of the book there was a list of communicants in the parish and stuff, and it was like work in progress stuff, but very, very, very interesting. And it was like a year's worth of sermons, so Easter Sunday and all this kind of stuff, Christmas and whatever. So I wrote an article about the manuscript sermons, but in particular about his funeral sermons, because there were a couple of interesting little funeral sermons in there. And so I transcribed them, and then I commented on them and talked about them. Among other things, the fact that actually Puritans didn't like funeral sermons very much at all, and so they kept them very, very brief, refused basically to pass judgment on the deceased, didn't like any kind of ornamentation, eulogies, anything like that. So I posted that quite fairly, maybe in the last year on Substack, I think. But
that's great. I'll have to go look that up. Yeah, for the listener, I think they'll be able to tell why I wanted to have you on, because a lot of our interests overlap, and a lot of our experience overlaps with my experience in seminary in the late. It was all 2011 to 2019. I was in seminary twice. Obviously, it was an evangelical seminary, but deeply compromised. And then with fitness and with my doctoral research on Puritan theology. But you've recently come out with this book, The Last Men. How much of your book, is when you read this book, I did this because my book, Offensive Christianity, is my second book. And I'm always curious to see people's intellectual trajectory over time. I think that's one of the most, kind of like you were doing with your academic research, seeing how places change over time. And I'm interested in people over time, especially theologians, academics, with your thesis, I think, dissertation or thesis at Oxford. Do you find did that inform, or is that informing your viewpoints in The Last Men?
I would probably say no. I don't know that there's a huge amount of overlap there at all, really. in broad terms, I think that the Reformation is probably the most important event in modern history, probably the most important event of the last 1,000 years, for all of its manifold effects that it's had on virtually every single facet of modern life that you could care to name. But yeah, I wouldn't say that there's a great deal of overlap there at all. I mean, I do talk about C.S. Lewis in the book. I talk about his idea of men without chests, for example. And interestingly enough, actually, there was a kind of hatchet job review of the book in First Things. Really, really bad review of the book that I think was probably motivated by bad intentions. It didn't strike me as any kind of attempt to engage with the arguments in good faith. And so I did actually end up writing a piece for American Greatness about it, where I said, like, this book may not be explicitly Christian, but actually here are reasons why Christians should take this book seriously and should think very carefully about the relationship between virtue and biology, and
Right.
And that is something that is in the book, definitely, although I don't develop it too much, but I do talk about the C.S. Lewis men without chests. And, you know, I mean, he was talking metaphorically, right? I mean, he was saying, he was using a series of metaphors about castration. You know, we castrate the gelding and bid it be fruitful, or whatever it is. He says, and he uses his metaphor, men without chests. Well, he was talking metaphorically, but I'm talking literally. I'm saying men today literally do not have chests, and it is because of biological changes that are taking place. And, you know, C.S. Lewis is talking about courage. He's talking about masculine virtue. He's talking about being a man. And my argument is, like, yeah, I mean, of course it's about virtue, but there is a biological substratum that makes it much harder to be a virtuous man if it's not there. So there are definitely ways, I think, that this book can be approached or can be useful to a Christian audience, and I would want it to. I mean, I've written it for a broad kind of general audience. I mean, I'm building on the Tucker Carlson documentary that I was in 2022, The End of Men. So this is The Last Men, and that was called The End of Men. I was in that with RFK Jr., who, as we know, is now Secretary of Health and Human Services. And that was about testosterone decline and the social and political implications of civilizational testosterone decline, which is what's happening. So, I mean, I think it's a blind point, actually, for a lot of Christians and for a lot of people who are suggesting, oh, well, what we need is, we need strong Christian men again. Well, like, you can't. I don't think you can ignore biology. You can talk about the importance of cultivating virtue and proper pedagogy, and you need Christian leaders in the community who teach young men and good fathers and all this kind of stuff. And that's all good. And I mean, I agree with that. But I think that actually you can't ignore what's happening at a biological level, or you ignore it at your peril, and you're actually potentially missing a big part of the problem that you can actually do something about as well.
Yes,
so,
exactly. And this is what I get after, is that for the Christians that deny the importance of these realities, these biological realities, T levels, and ways to mitigate against endocrine disruptors, there's a deep, unhelpful split between the material and immaterial, such that the material is denigrated, where they neglect their own bodies, which is highly ironic, considering we worship a savior who's embodied now, right? He has redeemed flesh. And so I get after this in my work a lot. I want to make sure I understand, in your book, kind of a big thing that comes up is Fukuyama and kind of the end of history thesis, with liberalism being dominant, and then the material, kind of chemical, biological, food, all this kind of stuff. So which is more upstream for you, or do they work in tandem? which gave rise to the other, I guess. Is it liberalism gave rise to these biological issues, or is it more of a biological issue that has
Sure.
generated liberalism as a problem?
It's worth actually, just before we talk about that, maybe talking a little bit about this split between the material and the
Yeah,
immaterial,
yeah.
or something like that. Because I mean, one of the things that was very striking actually in the review in First Things was the reviewer whose name I forget made a point about the fact that actually, if you glorify the body, or if you say that, testosterone is necessary for virtue, then you're misinterpreting sort of Christian history and the fact that actually you can be a saint with a body that is totally collapsing, and that self mortification and all this kind of stuff has always played a big role in church history. And I just thought, like, yeah, I mean, you don't need to deny any of that. You don't need to deny that women can be virtuous despite having far lower testosterone levels than men. That women can be extremely courageous. I mean, I'm very lucky. Actually, I've come from a family. My mother and my grandmother are incredibly courageous women. I wouldn't deny that at all. It almost seems to me like, I don't know whether it's willful ignorance or just like a desire, whether it's a fear, I don't know what it is, but it's like, I could just tell that there was like a real block there. It's like whoever it was reviewed the book just did not want even to consider the argument on its merits. And I do think that there are certain elements, obviously, of Christianity that make it much more difficult to do. But there are so many passages that you could talk about. Body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. I mean, yes, the central symbol of Christianity is God dying on the cross. It is a body that has been destroyed through torment and torture, but it's also the transcendence of death. I mean, it's an incredible story, actually, of overcoming
And
so it's not.
that's the thing. He's risen. Like he wasn't just, this is what, so, pardon me, listener, but, and I'm not getting away from orthodox biblical understanding of the significance of the death of Jesus on the cross, the physical, literal death of Jesus on the cross. But we believe as Christians, he rose from the grave. And it wasn't just some symbol. It wasn't an apparition. He wasn't a ghost. Like, he physically rose
Yeah.
from the grave by the power of God. And so the body is massively important. Of course, there could be a massive overcorrection, and we could go to a place that the Bible wouldn't permit us to go, and God doesn't encourage us to go, where we worship the body alone.
Sure.
But to not even account for it, to act that we have some kind of Gnostic, disembodied spirituality. It's very Buddhist in nature. It's very very strange amalgamation of spirituality and our eternal destiny as embodied creatures is embodied in glory. As Christians, we confess the Apostles' Creed, which talks about the resurrection from the dead. We will be embodied. Again, this is not to overcook the importance of the body, but it baffles me as well when I talk to Christians about these things. Like, your T levels will affect your ability to live out a virtuous life. Like,
Yeah.
and there's so many men who struggle with prayer and cultivating virtue and good habits and saying, killing their sin, all of these good things. And they need to do those things, but they're inhibited by biology, right? They're inhibited, and they're not helping themselves by being overweight or sedentary. And that frustrates me to a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing I said in the review was, like a low T society like ours is a society that is much less likely to produce men like, for example, the great crusading knights, the winged hussars who rode to the relief of Vienna in 1683. I mean, like, it kind of makes it almost makes a mockery of Christian history and of the forces that have helped sustain the faith. They're not the only forces that have sustained the faith, but they are significant ones, and they're ones that actually, I mean, do you want to disavow them? Do you want to say that they're not important, or that actually that things would have gone the way they've gone without them? So I find it I do find it strange. But okay, so to get back to the Fukuyama and the biology, I mean, my argument really is that liberalism is a low testosterone system. That's one central plank of my argument, is that I take Francis Fukuyama's argument about the end of history and thymos, which is this Greek word that means spiritedness. And I say, actually, you know what? Thymos is a very, very good proxy for testosterone. And so when Fukuyama says, and it's worth remembering, actually, you know, like Francis Fukuyama's book is called The End of History and the Last Man. And it's the "and the last man," the second half of the title, that people forget. They remember the end of history bit, but they forget that actually Fukuyama is also offering, in the final quarter of the book, quite a profound, really soul-searching Nietzschean critique of what happens to man at the end of history under liberalism. He doesn't think that it's an unalloyed good, the triumph of liberalism. He actually thinks that it will leave men fundamentally dissatisfied in certain ways, and one of those ways is certain forms of thymos, particularly megalothymia, which is the desire to be recognized as better than one's peers, to compete with one's peers, and to be arranged in a hierarchy, and, you know, to be above them, whatever. That can't be satisfied, and so I kind of turn Fukuyama's argument about thymos into an argument about testosterone and about the biological basis of male behavior and its kind of fate under liberalism. So that's one thing that I say, is that, or one of the central planks, is that actually, you know, liberalism itself is kind of a low testosterone system, and it's difficult for men to find satisfying outlets for their masculinity. And it's worth remembering that, you know, testosterone exists in feedback loops with behavior. So, you know, if you have high testosterone, you do certain things that reinforce having high testosterone, and it's like a virtuous cycle. If you have low testosterone, you end up doing things that reinforce having low testosterone, and you're going down, 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 and down, and down until you're at the bottom of a pit. You know, you lose, your testosterone goes down, you're less likely to compete, which means your testosterone, and it's like that. So there is a kind of biological element to this end of history scenario that hasn't really been brought out. So that's what I try and do. But then there's all these other things as well that are going on, like, for example, the ubiquity of harmful chemicals that interfere with our hormonal system. So they're called endocrine disruptors. And I mean, they are literally everywhere. It's one of these strange kinks, actually, of modern industrial chemistry and modern industry, that pretty much every chemical you can think of, every sort of herbicide, pesticide, chemical you find in deodorants, personal care products, on non-stick coatings, all these food additives, whatever, they all have this kink where they actually, in the human body, they either directly mimic estrogen, the female hormone, or they stimulate the production of estrogen or processes that are estrogenic. So we're bathed basically in a toxic soup that is interfering with the natural ratio between testosterone to estrogen in the human body. And that, in men, then that brings down testosterone levels, and it, you know, makes you put on weight. It reduces your libido, your fertility, your muscle mass, it affects your moods, etc. So, and it also has bad effects on women as well. So too much estrogen is bad for women too. So there's this kind of political problem that I've framed, but then there are also these environmental problems, problems of diet and lifestyle. So, people are overweight and they eat processed food. And I mean, being overweight reduces your testosterone. Being inactive reduces your testosterone, etc. So it's kind of like a double whammy. I mean, I don't think that liberalism necessarily created those problems, the problems of industry, because of course, I mean, they're problems you see today in China, and you would have seen in the Soviet Union too. I mean, we are talking about chemical structures and things like that. So it's not necessarily that like liberalism creates microplastics, for example. That's actually something that someone else said in quite another really bad faith review of the book, where they were like, I seem to think that liberalism is responsible for microplastics, but what about China? And I'm like, I am not saying that liberalism is responsible for microplastics. In many ways, the Soviet Union had a much worse environmental record than we do. I mean, they did abysmal things in Central Asia, like if you look at the Aral Sea, for example, and how polluted that became and disappeared. So I'm not saying that liberalism necessarily leads to the production of harmful chemicals that drain us of our testosterone. That isn't my argument. I'm just saying that there has been a confluence of these different factors. So we've got this low testosterone system, and then we've also got all this other stuff going on, which reinforces that and makes it worse. And basically, we're in a really bad pickle, And
Yeah.
So the two things reinforce each other, I think. It's like, I mean, there's this glib line that I use sometimes where I say, if it turned out that actually all of these harmful chemicals increased men's testosterone and made men more muscular, more thrusting, more politically engaged, more confident, then governments would have done something about these chemicals a long time ago, because they would actually, it would have made men far harder to govern. But actually, because these chemicals tend to reinforce, how shall we say, like conformist behavior and quiescent behavior, then actually they're not perhaps seen as quite so much of a problem that they might be. So I mean, it's a complex situation. There's a lot going on. But yes, broadly speaking, I'm saying it's political. This kind of situation that puts certain limits on our behavior as men. And then you've also got all this biological stuff that's going on, environmental stuff that's going on that reinforces it and makes it worse.
That makes sense. I don't have much time with you. I've got to talk about Christianity and vitalism.
Sure.
I've written on this a little bit in my work, and I'm looking forward to sending you a copy of my book. I just addressed Nietzsche on a couple of pages, but his critique of Christianity, and he's, from what I understand, he's kind of he writes a lot. And so there, he sees Jesus as both kind of this revolutionary, but also this founder. And what Christianity has become, at least in his day, is kind of a slave morality, pacifistic, this kind of thing. And as far as I know, vitalism is very deeply connected to kind of Nietzscheanism. Would you agree with Nietzsche's assessment of Christianity kind of being a slave morality? Or how would you, because I know you've written on Christianity and vitalism, how Christianity is kind of irreconcilable. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that a little bit more. I'm not saying that it can be necessarily reconciled. In the end, I don't agree with Nietzsche and his assessment.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think there's things we can appreciate about his critiques of Christianity, which actually are very prescient in my estimation. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I did write an essay about Christian vitalism, and it's on my Substack. Actually, you should be able to find it on there, because there were quite a lot of sort of simple-minded posts that I was seeing on Twitter about Christian vitalism and how the future for the church should just be kind of returning to the days of Hernan Cortés and the conquistadors and the knights, and you know, we could just have this muscular Christianity again that's expansionist and aggressive, and you know, for God and glory. And I was trying. It isn't that I necessarily disagree with the notion that there could be a Christian vitalism, or that Christianity has vitalist elements in it, because you know, we were just talking about the triumph over death and the physical transcendence of death. I mean, there isn't actually really a concept that I can imagine that is more vitalistic actually than the notion of a complete triumph over death. So it's not that I think that there isn't potential within Christianity. What I think, and what I was trying to argue actually in the essay, was that there's a problem with institutional Christianity, I think, that is exemplified, for example, by recent popes and their embrace, basically, of the great replacement, of demographic replacement in Europe. And we saw this very recently. July the 4th, where is the Pope? He's in Lampedusa, blessing migrants, in a very, very pointed rebuke of Donald Trump and of Donald Trump's policies. They already clashed. Before that, and there was a big brouhaha about that. But you know, so my argument was really that don't expect institutional Christianity to embrace a kind of life-affirming ideal. Don't expect institutional Christianity to go back to wanting to preserve traditional Christendom as Europe, basically. You know, like, actually now you've got a pope who is opening the gates for the barbarians into Europe. So it definitely wasn't an argument about a lack of vitalist potential within Christianity per se. It was much more about institutional Christianity and being realistic about the possibility for an institutional muscular Christianity. Like, I think in smaller sects and in smaller churches, then with a different kind of leadership, then I think that that's possible. But I don't think that the worldwide Anglican Communion led by the Archbishop of Canterbury is suddenly going to be, you know, harking back to the great Christian heroes of you know, the Middle Ages or the 16th and 17th centuries. Like, that's just not going to happen. That isn't going to happen. So,
yeah, I mean, well, even in England, with the Defender of the Faith has recently come out and become all inclusive, you know, and welcoming to all faiths. It's very shameful behavior. So I totally appreciate the cynicism on the institutional stuff. Am I right though when I'm connecting? You know, because some people have called my book and they've written reviews saying I'm promoting a muscular Christianity as if it's a problem, right?
Yes.
But vitalism is connected to Nietzsche in that it's kind of this energy, this thumos, this thymotic power, world conquering spirit. That's fair to say, right?
Well, I mean, what I would say is vitalism has a much deeper history than Nietzsche. So, I mean, vitalism actually, in many respects, was the default position of the sciences and philosophy for, you know, up until the modern age, really, when it was replaced with the kind of mechanism. I mean, really, if you're talking about vitalism in a kind of minimal sense, what you're talking about is the notion that there is something irreducible to life, that life is something different, that there is a force, or a life has a nature that is different from, let's say, like mere matter. And then, of course, you have the kind of mechanistic approach, which is, well, you know, we're all cogs basically in a machine, and you know, there isn't anything different between you or I and a rock at some kind of base physical level, at the level of atoms or quantum particles or whatever. So, I mean, vitalism definitely has a longer history than Nietzsche, but yeah, I mean, Nietzsche is the figure who is associated with vitalism today, and obviously his philosophy, certainly his later philosophy, takes on a much more explicitly anti-Christian um, uh, anti-Christian tinge or an anti-Christian theme. I mean, his last published work was The Antichrist, right?
Right. Right.
Where he kind of announces himself as a sort of antichrist figure and is teetering on the brink of madness, has possibly even kind of plunged into it. I mean, I think there are aspects of his critique of Christianity that are very perceptive, and I mean, it's worth remembering. His father was a Lutheran pastor. I mean, he was, he wasn't an outsider, and I think I was reading a biography of Nietzsche fairly recently. I mean, as he was at one point, he intended to follow his father into the ministry. I mean, so it's definitely kind of like an insider's view. I mean, we can pick holes in his kind of account of the emergence of, let's say, Christian morality as a slave revolt in an actual event that took place in history and an inversion of values. And I mean, there are elements of it that you can see that obviously, in many respects, Christianity is fundamentally opposed to the prevailing morality of Rome. I think that's pretty indisputable, and
Right.
And in many respects, Christianity triumphed over Roman traditional religion, not necessarily through force of arms, but through a kind of inner. Maybe let's not use subversion as the word, but you know what I mean. Like it was a values, kind of like a values-based triumph. It wasn't a military conquest or anything like that. It was something else. And I mean, I think some of the psychological things that he talks about are interesting. I think that the way that he talks about the emergence of the guilty conscience is very interesting. So, where he talks about the kind of what's he talking about? I mean, he talks about like the sense of cosmic debt, basically, that you have towards the creator, that kind of emerges out of the sense of original sin, and it kind of turns in on itself, and it kind of creates this kind of really unpleasant sort of inner complex. I wrote an essay for American Mind a couple of years ago about that guy Aaron Bushnell, who set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy. And I used Nietzsche's account of the emergence of the guilty conscience in Genealogy of Morality to describe basically like Aaron Bushnell's psychological journey from being a basically earnest, patriotic Christian, which is what he was when he first joined the US military, to becoming a self-hating leftist who thought that the only way that he could atone for the original sin of being born white and privileged was to set himself on fire to raise awareness of the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. It's one of, I think it's one of my most interesting essays, because it's very clearly Nietzsche, I think, understood at some level what a guilty conscience looks like and where it comes from and what it does to a person, and how it can force them into an extreme position where they actually think, I'm not worthy enough to live. I have to expiate my sin by killing myself, by setting myself on fire, which is what Aaron Bushnell did. But the really horrible element of that whole story is the fact that actually after Aaron Bushnell set himself on fire, all of these people, sort of like left-wing people of color, were saying actually that was an act of privilege that he did. It was an act of privilege for him to set himself on fire, because the people of Gaza don't have the privilege of committing suicide. They only have the privilege of being bombed to death by the Israelis. it was like a stunning, stunning bit of cruelty. It's like this guy's just killed himself because he feels so guilty, and you're saying actually that was an act of. I mean, like, if Nietzsche had been alive to see that, he would have, I mean, he would have chuckled or something. I mean, he really would have. But
Right.
so I mean, I definitely think there are aspects of Nietzsche's critique that are very, very penetrating and very interesting. Um, but whether or not it's it's obviously not a full account of Christianity. It's obviously, I don't think it's necessarily a plausible account of the historical emergence of Christianity. But I do think that he was a very penetrating psychologist, and certainly things like the kind of the guilty conscience that he talks about, I think is very good. And I also think that he's very good about the intellectual. The kind of the movements, the relationship between Christianity and things like liberalism and socialism. So the fact that socialism and in particular, and communism, that they are kind of afterbirths of Christianity in a sense. They are kind of secularized versions of Christianity. They have the same, basically there's the same kind of moral system, but stripped of the kind of metaphysical architecture or the kind of metaphysical surroundings.
Yeah, it's an anti-reality Christianity, and a lot of these movements are it's so sad when like the left does this to people. I mean, that's why people call it just a giant suicide cult. There's no theory of atonement, there's no forgiveness, there's no mercy,
No.
there's no way to triumph. It's just death all the way down, and it's really sad. Is it growing up, you're an Englishman, conservative leaning, is Christianity something you would call yourself a Christian, or at this point are you going to church or anything like that? What is kind of that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a baptized Church of England for whatever good that does me. I mean, I grew up going to church. I did go to Sunday school for a period as a child, but I mean, I went to a village Church of England school. We were regularly in the church, which was next door to the school. So I mean, I would say that it's like the T.S. Eliot thing, the idea of a Christian society. Like, I don't think Western society isn't going to stop being Christian in a sense until there is an alternative positive ideal. So we're kind of Christians in a negative sense, in the sense that actually nothing else has come along yet. So I mean, culturally, I very definitely am a Christian. I think anybody who tries to argue, anybody who is a Westerner who tries to argue that they're not in some fundamental sense a Christian, they end up in the realms of absurdity. And that's exactly what happens with these new atheist types, with Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, especially, where they sort of try to claim that their sort of like secular morality of just be a good person is just what you would believe if you were a rational person, rather than actually just being Christianity stripped of its metaphysical accoutrements.
Right.
It's like look at the history of the world. Universal morality, universalism is not the norm. Like, you believe in the universal dignity of humanity and of individuals, the inherent moral worth of individuals for a reason, and that is because you are the product of 2,000 years of Christian history, and
Right.
an even longer history of monotheism and whatever. So it's like, I'm very definitely, obviously, a cultural Christian. I mean, at times I've tried very hard, actively tried to be Christian, and certainly when I was doing the DPhil, I was going to chapel a lot in the college, and going to, because I wanted to. I'm writing and studying about Christianity. I need to see it from the inside. I need to, because one of the chapters of the book of the thesis is about church music, and which I didn't think I would be writing about, but actually it was really, really fascinating, church music in the Reformation. and I mean, it does make a difference to be in a medieval building listening to an organ, like, and you are performing the liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer that Thomas Cranmer wrote, right? So I was tapped into it, and I was definitely receptive. I mean, my feeling is that I think I'm going to need to be knocked on my ass by God, basically, is how I kind of feel. I feel something's going to have to happen that will allow me to bridge the gap, because there is still a gap and I can't get across it myself. So, but I mean, I'm definitely sympathetic. I mean, I've studied, I grew up in a Christian environment, like I say, and I've studied Christianity. I am very sympathetic, and to see the Catholic Church in the state that it's in, the Pope. I mean, it does make me. It does, and the Church of England. It does make me angry, genuinely.
Yeah. Well, I will hope that you don't have to get beat, to come to Christ. But if such cases are necessary, then I can also pray for that as well. But I would, yeah, I'll send you a copy of my book. I guess the last question,
Please.
I know you're pressed for time, is if somebody takes your book, The Last Man, and we've diagnosed the problem. What is the future? What is it we're trying to push men towards? Is it just they got to go get TRT and get up to 800 at least on their T levels, and we'll save civilization? What are we looking at here as kind of like the positive thesis, the way forward for men today?
Well, so I mean, like, in line with what I do on Twitter and in my other writing, then part of the prescription is for men to take control of their own lives, to clean up their diets, to minimize their exposure to harmful chemicals, to exercise. So there is definitely an individual prescription. It would be good for more men, to look after their health, and there is this there is definitely a burgeoning movement. I think a lot of men are kind of rebelling against the way they're encouraged to live, and the way that they do live. So that's good. But then there's also, I think, the necessity for a political movement, because so many of the problems that afflict us, like harmful chemicals in the environment, individuals can't do anything about that. Like, you can't do anything about DuPont, releasing PFAS chemicals into rivers and bodies of water. Like, you can't. Like, you need regulations. You need a political movement like Make America Healthy Again to change the way that chemicals are licensed, to change the way that food additives are licensed, to change the way that kids eat at school and the way that they're educated, to incentivize exercise and healthy living and all this kind of stuff. But then actually, the book ends with a series of questions, because, like I said earlier, my thesis is that actually there is something fundamentally wrong, or there's something fundamentally unsatisfying about liberal democracy, and which is what Fukuyama says, and what Nietzsche is saying too. So we could clean up the environment, and we could get all the harmful chemicals out of the environment. We could make it so that kids are all exercising at school, and everybody's healthy and happy, and we're all eating red meat and eggs and drinking raw milk. But there will still be this problem about the political system itself, and whether that's actually a satisfying system to live in. And I mean, I don't just I mean that for men, but also, I mean, I think it just in general. Is this really how we want to live for the rest of history? So I think maybe, like, what would the future look like? Well, okay, we've solved the biological problems. We've fixed and then we're going to confront this bigger problem about the political system, and whether we want to live a different way, whether we want to live a better kind of existence that actually allows us to lift our eyes up from the ground in front of us, and maybe look up at the stars and the sky, and wonder and ask big questions and do great things.
All right. Well,
I look forward to this future. I'll still look at the stars here in Colorado when I go into the mountains. But, for people who want to pick up a copy of your book, where can they find it?
So you can get it on Amazon. It's in hardcover, Kindle, and audiobook format. So just go to Amazon. The Last Men, Liberalism, and the Death of Masculinity.
Excellent. Did you read the audiobook yourself?
No, I didn't. Unfortunately, I should get them to do a version where I do it, because with my previous book, the Eggs Benedict option, then I did, and it took such a long time to do it.
Yeah, it's hard work. Well, I'll direct people there, and then your Twitter handle for people that want to follow you on Twitter. What is that?
Is baby gravy 9.
Baby gravy 9. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Listener, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Pleasure.
Thanks,
pleasure.
Charles.
Well, that'll do it for that episode. A huge thanks to Charles Cornish-Dale for coming on. Go pick up The Last Men on Amazon in hardcover, Kindle, or audiobook. Follow him on X at babygravy9. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For those who either tuned in late or missed the front of the episode, go check out commonplace.study for AI-powered, reformed, and Puritan research, real citations, real sources that you can find over at commonplace.study. Register for Burn the Ships at boulderwell.org/burntheships to hear from Dr. Stephen Wolfe and Dr. Joe Rigney. And don't forget to pick up a copy of my book, Offensive Christianity, at offensivechristianitybook.com. Go ahead and buy a second one to hand out to a guy in your life who needs to read it, would find it encouraging. And if this episode helped you, sharpened you, challenged you, share it with a friend, leave it a rating and subscribe. Smash that subscribe button on YouTube so you never miss out on episodes. Until next time, we'll see you next week.